When my daughter first started school, I remember feeling a sense of pride, mixed with the familiar anxiety all parents feel when their child steps into a new chapter of their life. She was always the bubbly, energetic type, so full of life, always quick to make friends, always eager to tell stories about the new adventures she had. The thought that she would thrive in school was never a question in my mind. She was that child who could talk to anyone, her smile infectious, her laugh contagious. I watched her with pride as she made friends with such ease, her heart wide open to everyone she met. Every day, she'd come home from school, excited to share details of her day, the games they played, the things they learned, the new people she had met. Her energy was boundless, and I cherished those moments of joy she brought home every single day. But as the weeks went by, something began to shift. I noticed it in the small changes at first. She would come home quieter, more withdrawn than usual. At first, I chalked it up to the usual adjustment period. New routines, new faces, new challenges. That's what I told myself. But then the bruises started showing up, first a small scratch here and there, then something larger. At first, I didn't think much of it. Children are rough with each other, kids are sometimes careless when they're playing. But then the bruises grew bigger, darker, and more frequent. Every day she would come home, and I would ask her how her day was, only to be met with vague answers. She was always careful with her words, evasive even. The lively, sociable girl who would tell me everything about her school day seemed to be slipping away before my eyes. And then came the repeated statements, small hints that I couldn't ignore. She would say, "The boys are mean to me, Mom. They push me, and they call me names." I didn't want to believe her at first. My mind tried to convince me it was just part of growing up, that maybe she was being too sensitive, that children can sometimes say things that aren't true in the heat of the moment. But the bruises and scratches didn't lie. They were right there in front of me, visible, painful reminders of something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Every night, I asked her again about her day. And each time, she gave the same answer, a little more defeated, a little more afraid. "The boys pushed me," she would say. "It's nothing, Mom. I'm fine." And yet, the marks on her skin grew larger, the joy she once carried seemed to slip further away with each passing day. The girl who had once been so eager to talk was now retreating into herself, closing off from me, and it broke my heart to watch. At first, I told myself it was just part of adjusting to school. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something much more serious than I was willing to admit. As the weeks wore on, I became increasingly concerned, but I told myself that I needed to stay calm. Maybe I was overreacting. I didn't want to believe that my daughter, my sweet, energetic girl, was being bullied at school. I convinced myself it was just a phase, that she was being sensitive, or maybe even misinterpreting things. After all, children often make up stories or embellish their experiences. It had to be that, right? But then came the day when I couldn't ignore it any longer. My daughter came home with a fresh bruise on her arm, so big and dark it was impossible to dismiss. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight, and when I asked her what happened, she simply shook her head. "It's nothing, Mom," she muttered, her eyes avoiding mine. I knew I had to act. This couldn't go on. I made an appointment with the school, determined to speak to someone, to get to the bottom of this. I hoped that the teachers would be able to assure me that everything was fine, and this was just a small issue that would pass with time. When I finally met with her teacher, I explained the situation, how my daughter had been coming home with bruises and how she had been acting differently. I told the teacher about the vague comments my daughter had made about the boys pushing her around. I could feel my voice faltering as I spoke, but I had to get this out. I needed to understand what was happening. The teacher listened carefully, nodded thoughtfully, and then assured me that everything was fine at school. "We've had no reports of any bullying," she said calmly. "Your daughter is doing well in class, and she seems to get along with the other students. But the bruises, I began to protest. They're probably just a result of rough play, she interrupted gently. Kids can sometimes be a bit careless. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. We'll keep an eye on her, though. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that my daughter's pain was just part of growing up, that the bruises were nothing but minor accidents. The teacher was reassuring, and her kind tone made me feel like I was being overprotective. After all, the school had so much experience, and surely they would know if something was wrong. I left the meeting feeling somewhat reassured, though a small part of me still felt uneasy. I hoped that my daughter's behavior would improve, that she would feel better about school. But deep down, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was being overlooked, that my daughter's pain wasn't being taken seriously. Later that evening, I asked my daughter once again about the boys at school. They pushed me, Mom, she whispered. They made fun of me, but it's fine. I don't want to talk about it. I could see how much she was trying to protect me from the truth, how much she wanted to hide her fear from me. But I could also see how deeply it was affecting her. She wasn't herself anymore. She wasn't the happy, talkative girl she had once been. And despite the teacher's reassurances, I couldn't ignore the growing worry in my heart. The days blurred together as I watched my daughter grow smaller in spirit with each passing week. The bruises were becoming more than just a few marks here and there, they were large, dark, and undeniable. And they didn't fade like the minor ones had before. I could see how much it was affecting her, how she was retreating further into herself, like she was trying to disappear, to become invisible. Her once joyful demeanor had turned into quiet withdrawal. She no longer laughed, no longer eagerly shared stories from her day. Each evening, as we sat together for dinner, I could see the shadows in her eyes. She would pick at her food, not making eye contact, her shoulders slumped in a way that made her seem so much smaller than she truly was. One afternoon, she came home clutching her arm, tears streaming down her face. Her eyes were swollen, her lips slightly cut, and the bruise on her cheek was purple and angry. The sight of her, so fragile and defeated, tore at me in ways I couldn't explain. My heart ached with each breath I took as I knelt down beside her, asking in a soft voice, "Sweetheart, what happened?" "It's nothing, Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm okay." I could feel the weight of her words, the unspoken truth that she was too afraid to say out loud. She was hiding it, trying to protect me from the pain of what she was going through. But how could I sit by and do nothing? How could I ignore the evidence of what she was suffering in silence? The marks on her body were too significant to dismiss any longer. There was no way this was just a result of rough play. The wounds were too deep, and the fear in her eyes was too real. I felt the tightness in my chest, the anxiety gnawing at me as I realized that I had failed to protect her in the way I should have. I knew it was time to go back to the school. I couldn't stand by any longer, hoping that the situation would get better on its own. The bruises on her body were a silent scream I could no longer ignore, and I would not rest until I got answers. I made an appointment with the school principal, this time determined to make my voice heard. My daughter's well-being was at stake, and I couldn't afford to let them brush me off again. When I sat across from the principal and explained everything, the bruises, the marks, the emotional toll it was taking on my daughter, there was a moment of silence. But then, as the principal listened, she gave me the same response. "We've investigated the situation, and there's no indication of bullying. Your daughter seems to be adjusting fine. We've had no complaints from other students or teachers." The words were like a punch to the gut. No indication of bullying. I thought. But how could they say that when my daughter's body was covered in bruises? I looked at the principal's face, and I saw the indifference there. The same dismissal I had felt in the teacher's eyes during our previous meeting. They weren't listening, not really. The marks on my daughter's body were invisible to them, a fleeting concern that didn't seem to warrant any real action. I was just another parent making a fuss. I left the meeting feeling more defeated than I had ever felt before. The school, the very place that was supposed to protect my child, wasn't doing anything. They were allowing this to continue, turning a blind eye to the violence my daughter was enduring. My heart sank as I realized that no one was going to help us. Days passed, and the bruises on my daughter's body grew worse. It became harder for her to hide the evidence of the violence. The small cuts on her arms, the swelling on her face, the bruises that would no longer fade, each one was a silent scream I couldn't ignore. She had stopped speaking of the boys. She no longer told me about her day. There were no more stories of friends or games. There was only silence, silent tears, silent pain, and silent withdrawal. One evening, after helping her with her homework, something inside her finally broke. She looked at me with eyes so full of sorrow and fear that I felt my heart shatter in an instant. She didn't speak at first. She just sat there, her small body trembling, as if holding back a storm of emotions. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I don't want to go to school anymore, Mom." Her words were muffled by sobs, her small hands clutching the edge of the table as if holding on to something that might disappear. "They keep hurting me, Mom," she cried. "They won't stop. I don't know how to make it stop." Her words spilled out between sobs, raw and desperate. "I don't know how to make them stop hurting me." It was like a dam had burst. The quiet girl who had once been full of life, who had hidden her pain so carefully, was now broken in front of me. The mother in me felt like I had failed her. I had let her suffer in silence, convincing myself that the teachers, the principal, the school would protect her. But they hadn't. And now my daughter was asking me for help, for something I should have done long ago. I had trusted the system. I had trusted the people who were supposed to protect my child. But they had turned a blind eye to her suffering, and in doing so, they had allowed it to continue. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I held her in my arms that night, whispering soothing words as she cried, but deep down, I knew that the time for comforting was over. It was time to take action. I couldn't wait for the school to help me. I couldn't rely on them anymore. I had to be the one to protect my daughter. And I would do whatever it took to make sure she felt safe again. The next morning, I pulled her out of school. It was a decision I had struggled with, but I knew it was the only way to protect her. I called a lawyer, I contacted Child Protective Services, and I began gathering evidence. No longer would I sit idly by, hoping someone else would fix this. I would not allow my daughter to live in fear any longer. I was going to fight for her. In the days that followed, I received phone calls from the school, concerned inquiries about her absence, polite questions about whether there was something they could do. But I knew what they were really asking. They wanted to brush this under the rug, to pretend it hadn't happened. But I wasn't going to let them. I documented everything, the bruises, the scratches, the pictures of her swollen face. I made sure that no one could deny the truth anymore. I filed complaints with the school district, and I contacted the media. The more I fought, the more I realized how much I had to fight for, not just my daughter, but for every child who had ever been silenced by a system that didn't care. The fight wasn't easy. It was long, and it was exhausting. But my daughter slowly began to heal. She started to regain the light in her eyes, the spark of who she once was. It wasn't a fast recovery. The scars would take time to fade, both the physical ones and the emotional ones. But with every step forward, I knew we were on the right path. And as for the school, the changes came slowly. The media picked up the story, and the school district was forced to confront the reality of what had been happening. The teachers, the principal, they couldn't ignore the truth anymore. They couldn't hide behind their reassurances and polite words. But it was too late. My daughter had been hurt, and no amount of apologies could take that away. In the end, my daughter didn't just survive. She thrived. She learned that her voice mattered, that her pain mattered. And I learned that sometimes, you have to stand up and fight when the system fails you. Sometimes, you have to be the one to make the change. And I would do it again. For her. For us. Reading this story broke my heart. It's so difficult to even imagine the pain a parent must feel when they realize that their child is suffering, especially when that suffering is hidden behind walls of silence and fear. What makes this story even more devastating is the fact that the mother's attempts to seek help from the school were met with indifference, leaving her feeling helpless and alone in her fight to protect her daughter. At first, the mother's reluctance to believe that her daughter was being bullied makes sense. As a parent, you want to protect your child from the harshness of the world, and you want to believe that everything is fine. But as the bruises become more frequent and severe, that nagging feeling in her heart that something isn't right grows stronger. Her daughter's transformation from a lively, sociable girl to someone who shrinks away from everything is a gut-wrenching reminder of how insidious bullying can be. What really hit me was the emotional devastation of the moment when the daughter finally breaks down and admits, "I don't want to go to school anymore." That moment encapsulates the real, raw pain of a child who has suffered in silence for so long, too afraid to speak up. And as a mother, seeing her child in that much distress is a powerful wake-up call. The mother's decision to act was both heartbreaking and empowering. She could no longer trust the system that was supposed to protect her daughter, and in that moment, she knew she had to take matters into her own hands. The determination she shows, the refusal to let her daughter continue to suffer in silence, is truly admirable. The courage it takes to fight against a system that dismisses your concerns is unimaginable, but the mother does it, and her daughter starts to heal. It's a story about love, fear, and the raw strength of a mother's determination to protect her child. It's also about how vital it is to listen when someone is in pain, especially when they don't have the words to speak for themselves. No child should feel like their voice doesn't matter or that they have to suffer alone. This story left me feeling deeply moved and reminded me of the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult the fight may be.